The cameras were rolling, the audience was cheering, and then 18-year-old Emma Torres stood at the Family Feud podium with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to find beauty in borrowed time, her skin slightly pale from treatments that had bought her months instead of years, her eyes holding the profound wisdom that comes from facing mortality at an age when most people are planning decades of future. When Steve Harvey asked about the hardest truths you have to face, Emma's response, delivered with the serene honesty of someone who had made peace with the unthinkable, would reveal what it means to live fully when living has an expiration date that everyone can see but no one wants to acknowledge. "That this will be my last Christmas," Emma had said, her voice carrying the weight of medical reports, family conversations held in whispers, and the recognition that the genetic condition that had been slowly stealing her strength was now winning a race against time that had never been fair. "I have maybe 6 months left, and my family is still planning like I'll be here next year." The studio had fallen into the kind of profound silence that comes when people are confronted with the reality of mortality in its most raw and immediate form, the recognition that death doesn't wait for convenient timing, that terminal illness doesn't respect age or dreams, or the desperate hopes of families who refuse to accept the unacceptable. Emma Torres had been diagnosed with Batten disease, a rare genetic disorder that progressively destroys nerve cells in the brain and other parts of the body, when she was 12 years old. The diagnosis had come after months of mysterious symptoms, vision problems, seizures, cognitive changes and motor difficulties that had initially been attributed to various other conditions before genetic testing had revealed the devastating truth about Emma's condition and prognosis. Batten disease is a fatal condition with no cure and limited treatment options. When Emma had been diagnosed, her doctors had explained that she might live into her early 20s if she was fortunate, but that the disease would progressively rob her of her abilities, her independence, and eventually her life. The news had shattered the Torres family's understanding of their future and had forced them to confront the reality that their daughter would not live to experience many of the milestones that parents take for granted. The initial years following Emma's diagnosis had been a whirlwind of second opinions, experimental treatments, and desperate searches for clinical trials that might offer hope. The Torres family had traveled across the country seeking specialists, had connected with other Batten families through support networks, and had dedicated themselves to fundraising for research, while simultaneously trying to give Emma as normal a childhood as possible despite the shadow of her prognosis. Emma had shown remarkable resilience throughout her early teenage years, maintaining excellent grades despite increasing seizures, participating in school activities when her energy permitted, and developing a mature perspective on life that had impressed everyone who met her. She had become an advocate for Batten disease research, had spoken at fundraising events, and had used her experience to help other families navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges of living with terminal childhood illness. For 6 years, Emma had lived with the knowledge that her time was limited, but the progression of her condition had been gradual enough that her family had been able to maintain hope that new treatments might be developed, that her particular case might prove less aggressive than typical, or that medical miracles might somehow change the trajectory of her disease. This hope had become both a source of strength and a barrier to accepting the reality of Emma's prognosis. But over the past year, Emma's condition had deteriorated more rapidly than anyone had anticipated. Her seizures had become more frequent and severe, requiring adjustments to her medications that had left her feeling constantly fatigued and slightly disoriented. Her vision had continued to decline, making reading and other visual tasks increasingly difficult and forcing her to rely on audiobooks and voice-to-text technology for her schoolwork. Most significantly, her cognitive function had begun showing signs of the irreversible damage that characterized the advanced stages of Batten disease. The cognitive changes had been particularly difficult for Emma to accept because her intelligence and academic abilities had always been central to her identity and her sense of self-worth. She had begun experiencing memory problems, difficulty concentrating for extended periods, and occasional confusion that reminded her constantly of the progressive nature of her condition. These changes had also made it impossible for her family to maintain their denial about the progression of her disease. Recent medical evaluations had confirmed what Emma had suspected, but her family had refused to acknowledge that her condition was progressing toward its final stages. Her neurologist had gently explained that while they could continue managing her symptoms to maintain quality of life, the trajectory of her disease suggested that she likely had months rather than years remaining. This conversation had taken place with Emma present, despite her parents' request that medical discussions be held privately, because Emma had insisted on being fully informed about her own condition. The most difficult aspect of Emma's situation had been the disconnect between her acceptance of her prognosis and her family's continued denial. While Emma had reached a place of peace with her limited time and had begun focusing on making her remaining months meaningful and joyful, her parents, Maria and Carlos Torres, had continued planning for a future that medical reality made impossible. Maria had continued researching experimental treatments and clinical trials, spending hours online reading about potential breakthroughs and contacting researchers about Emma's eligibility for studies that might offer hope. Carlos had refused to discuss end-of-life planning, had become angry when Emma had tried to talk about her wishes for her final months, and had insisted that the family needed to focus on fighting rather than accepting defeat. Emma had wanted to create bucket list experiences, had asked to visit places and do things that might not be possible if her condition continued to worsen, and had tried to have honest conversations with her family about her wishes for her remaining time. She had wanted to see the ocean one more time, had hoped to attend her best friend's wedding in the spring, and had asked to spend Christmas in a special way that acknowledged the significance of what would likely be their final holiday together. But Maria and Carlos had responded to these requests with denial, insisting that Emma needed to stay positive, continue fighting, and plan for recovery rather than accepting defeat. They had interpreted her desire to make meaningful memories as giving up hope, had become upset when she had talked about death or dying, and had tried to redirect conversations toward treatment options and research developments. The emotional burden of protecting her family's feelings while managing her own needs had been overwhelming for Emma. She had found herself in the impossible position of having to pretend hope she didn't feel in order to maintain her parents' emotional stability, while simultaneously trying to process her own fears, grief, and desires for how to spend her limited time. Emma had begun working with a counselor who specialized in helping young people cope with terminal illness, and through these sessions she had learned that her desire to face reality and plan accordingly was not only normal but healthy. The counselor had helped her understand that accepting her prognosis didn't mean giving up hope. It meant hoping for different things like meaningful relationships, peaceful moments, and the ability to die with dignity when the time came. Emma's younger sister, Isabella, age 15, had been caught between Emma's realistic acceptance and their parents' desperate denial. Isabella had understood intellectually that Emma's condition was terminal, but had struggled with the emotional reality of losing her sister and had often joined their parents in encouraging Emma to focus on treatment and hope rather than on preparing for death. The sibling dynamic had been particularly complex because Isabella had simultaneously wanted to protect Emma from additional stress while also wanting to have honest conversations about what Emma's death would mean for their family. Isabella had found herself grieving not only Emma's impending death, but also the loss of the sister relationship they had always expected to have throughout their adult lives. The isolation that Emma had experienced was profound and heartbreaking. At an age when most teenagers are worried about college applications, relationships, and career planning, Emma was confronting questions about legacy, meaning, and how to say goodbye to people she loved. She had wanted to talk openly about her fears and hopes, had needed support in making decisions about her care and her remaining time, but had found herself surrounded by people who loved her too much to let her be honest about her reality. Emma had begun keeping a private journal where she could be honest about her feelings, fears, and wishes without having to protect anyone else's emotions. She had written about her sadness at missing future experiences, graduating from high school, going to college, falling in love, getting married, having children, and about her struggle to find meaning and purpose in a life that would be cut short before she could accomplish most of her dreams. She had also written about her fear of pain and disability, her concern about being a burden on her family during her final months, her desire to be remembered for who she had been rather than for her illness, and her frustration with being unable to have honest conversations with her family about her situation. The journal had become her safe space for processing emotions that she felt unable to share with the people closest to her. The Family Feud application had been submitted by Carlos Torres, who had hoped that appearing on television might create positive memories for the family and might provide a distraction from the medical concerns that had dominated their lives for the past year. He had thought that focusing on fun, competition, and family bonding might help Emma maintain the positive attitude that he believed was essential for her continued fighting. The trip to the studio had been physically challenging for Emma, requiring careful planning around her medication schedule and seizure management. But she had been excited about the opportunity to do something normal and fun with her family, and had appreciated the chance to be seen as a complete person rather than just as a patient with a terminal illness. During the pre-show preparations, Emma had participated with grace and enthusiasm, genuinely enjoying the experience of being with her family in a setting that wasn't defined by medical appointments, treatments, or discussions about her condition. The production staff had been impressed by her maturity, intelligence, and positive attitude, noting that she had a wisdom and perspective that seemed far beyond her years. But the contrast between the celebratory atmosphere of the show and the reality of her prognosis had been emotionally complex for her to navigate. While she had genuinely enjoyed the experience, she had also been acutely aware that this might be one of her last opportunities to participate in normal family activities, and she had felt the weight of trying to create meaningful memories while her family maintained their denial about why these memories were so important. The game had been proceeding with the Torres family playing enthusiastically against the Wilson family from Georgia. Emma had been participating fully, her intelligence and quick wit evident despite the physical limitations imposed by her condition. She had answered several questions correctly, had laughed at Steve's jokes, and had seemed to be genuinely enjoying herself in ways that had made her family hopeful about her state of mind. Her family had been proud and celebratory, treating the experience as a positive adventure rather than acknowledging it as one of Emma's final opportunities to participate in normal family activities. Maria had been taking pictures constantly. Carlos had been encouraging Emma to be more assertive in answering questions, and Isabella had been excited about the possibility of their family winning money that could be used for Emma's medical expenses. But when it came time for the category "The Hardest Truths You Have to Face," and it was Emma's turn at the buzzer, the question had struck directly at the heart of the reality she had been living with alone while her family maintained their protective denial. Steve Harvey had approached the podium with his usual warm energy, but something about Emma's serene composure and the depth in her eyes had made him more attentive and gentle than usual. "All right, Emma," Steve had said softly, "the hardest truths you have to face. What comes to mind?" Emma had looked at her family, at her parents, who were watching with love and hope, and at Isabella, who was trying to maintain optimism despite growing understanding, then back at Steve with the kind of honesty that comes from someone who has learned that truth, however painful, is more valuable than comfortable lies. "That this will be my last Christmas," Emma had said, her words carrying 6 years of living with terminal illness and 6 months of accepting that hope and denial could not change medical reality. "I have maybe 6 months left, and my family is still planning like I'll be here next year." The studio had become completely silent, as everyone present understood that they were witnessing something sacred, a young woman's honest confrontation with mortality and the family dynamics that sometimes make dying more difficult than it needs to be. Steve had paused, clearly moved by Emma's courage and the weight of what she had shared. "Emma," Steve had said gently, "that takes incredible strength to face, and even more strength to say out loud." "I've known for 6 years that I wouldn't live a normal lifespan," Emma had said, her voice steady but emotional. "But this year, the disease has gotten worse faster than we expected. The doctors have been honest with me about what that means, but my family isn't ready to hear it." Steve had looked at Maria and Carlos Torres, who were clearly struggling to process their daughter's words. "Mr. and Mrs. Torres," Steve had said with infinite compassion, "how do you respond to what Emma just shared?" "We're not giving up," Maria had said through tears. "There are new treatments, clinical trials. We're not ready to accept that this is the end." Emma had looked at her mother with profound love and sadness. "Mom, I'm not giving up either," Emma had said gently. "But I'm also not pretending anymore. I want to spend my remaining time doing things that matter to me, with people I love, without having to pretend I believe in miracles that aren't coming." Steve had looked at Emma with deep respect and understanding. "Emma," Steve had said, "what would spending your time meaningfully look like to you?" "I want to travel somewhere beautiful with my family," Emma had said. "I want to write letters to people who have mattered to me. I want to celebrate this Christmas like it's the most important one we'll ever have together, because it is. And I want my family to stop being afraid of my reality so we can actually enjoy the time we have left." Steve had begun removing his suit jacket, understanding that this moment required both recognition of Emma's courage and acknowledgement of her family's grief. "Emma," Steve had said, placing the jacket around her shoulders, "this jacket represents something very special today. It represents the understanding that living fully isn't about time, it's about love, truth, and making every moment count." Emma had pulled the jacket closer, the gesture providing comfort and recognition of the wisdom she had gained through facing the unthinkable. Steve had turned to address Emma's family directly. "Maria, Carlos, Isabella," Steve had said, "Emma is showing incredible courage and maturity. She's not asking you to give up hope, she's asking you to hope for the right things. hope for quality time together, hope for meaningful experiences, hope for the kind of love that makes every day precious. Steve had then addressed the studio audience. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve had announced, Emma Torres is teaching us something beautiful about life and death. She's showing us that facing truth doesn't mean giving up, it means living authentically and loving completely while we have the chance. The game had resumed with a completely different family dynamic, as the Torres family began to understand that honoring Emma's wishes wasn't about accepting defeat, but about celebrating life in the time they had together. When Steve had asked the final question about things that make life worth living, Emma had answered, "Love that's brave enough to face truth together." The episode aired 2 months later and became one of the most powerful discussions about terminal illness, family dynamics, and living fully that had ever appeared on television. Hospice organizations and family counseling services used Emma's story to help other families navigate the complex emotions surrounding terminal diagnosis and end-of-life planning. Emma had spent her final months exactly as she had hoped, traveling with her family to see the ocean, writing letters to friends and teachers who had impacted her life, and celebrating what became known in their family as the most important Christmas ever. She had died peacefully at home in the spring, surrounded by family members who had learned to face truth with love and to make every moment count. Emma had kept Steve's jacket as a symbol of the moment when her truth was finally heard and honored by her family. More importantly, the Torres family had begun focusing on creating meaningful experiences together rather than maintaining denial about Emma's prognosis. The jacket represented Emma's understanding that dying with dignity requires living with honesty, that love is strongest when it's brave enough to face difficult truths, and that the most meaningful time families can share is time spent being authentic with each other. Because that's what courage looks like when it faces the ultimate truth and chooses love over denial. That's what family sounds like when it learns to honor someone's reality rather than protecting its own hopes. And that's what happens when an 18-year-old woman teaches everyone around her that living fully isn't about length of time but about depth of love, honesty of communication, and the willingness to make every moment count. Emma Torres had been living with terminal illness for 6 years, but on that day at Family Feud, she helped her family discover that the most precious gift they could give each other was the courage to face truth together and to love each other authentically in whatever time they had left.